So where will Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 end? Stay tuned to not find out, but I present to you 3 theories. Let's get odd. I should probably change this shirt by now, but I'm not going to. So there's not much specific news in regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, but what we can do in the meantime is kind of speculate and theorize. And one thing that's on a lot of people's minds is how many parts will the game be, which we don't know. How many chapters will Part 2 be, which we don't know. But one thing I think about often is where Part 2 will end. So my first theory is Cosmo Canyon. I made a video a while back kind of predicting where Part 2 will go next, and I kind of laid out all the chapters. It might be outdated at this point because I did make it a while back, but I might make an updated video. Definitely let me know if you're interested in that. But in my predictions, I had Part 2 ending at Cosmo Canyon. Recently, I went into detail in a video talking about the jukebox theory, seeing if it's possible if the jukebox tracks give clues as to Part 2, and that video also ended the game at Cosmo Canyon. So this is kind of my personal theory, but the way I thought about it is the pacing of Midgar and Part 1. I thought it was incredible how they stretched out Midgar to make it one full experience and one full game, although other people would argue that it's not a full game, but I thought it was a full experience at least. And the way I see it is they inserted a lot of new stuff into Part 1 to create a full experience. So for example, Chapter 4, Mad Dash, that wasn't in the original. That kind of gave the developers an opportunity to expand on the backstory of Jessie and send her on a mission, and then send Biggs and Wedge and Cloud on their own mission, introducing the character of Roche, and then other things like the train graveyard, which I think if you walk fast enough, the train graveyard in the original was maybe 15-20 seconds, and then they somehow expanded that into its own chapter. And the same goes for the sewers, it got its own chapter. But then there's other things like the sun lamps, that wasn't in the original, but that made an amazing chapter in Remake Part 1 as well. So in terms of pacing, I think that Part 1 will end at Cosmo Canyon. I think the finale of that would be pretty awesome. Like maybe the second to last chapter would be Cosmo Canyon itself, and then running around the village doing all sorts of side quests, and then perhaps the last chapter would be going into the cave of the Gi, I think, and that would be an amazing finale. I got a lot of comments in that video saying there's no way it's going to end at Cosmo Canyon, which, I mean, we don't know, but that's just my personal theory. I remember one comment saying Cosmo Canyon's not epic enough, which is fair. You know, maybe Cosmo Canyon isn't epic enough, but you know, Midgar Remake Part 1 had a Sephiroth fight, which wasn't in the original, but that was a pretty cool ending to Part 1. You know, other than the whispers and the fate and all that stuff. Like, for example, the journey after leaving Calm and walking towards the Chocobo farm, they could easily add enough stuff in there to make it its own chapter. I'm not saying it's just going to be like in the OG where it's just walking. They're going to add enough stuff in there to make it interesting, in my opinion at least. Or going through the cave and ending up towards Junon. In the OG, it's just simply walking, but in the remake, I think they could either create a section, create a new location, create a village, something like that. So theory 2 is Part 2 will end at Temple of the Ancients. I think I read this in one of the comments on that older video. And personally, I don't think that it will end at Temple of the Ancients, just in terms of comparing the pacing of Remake Part 1 and it being only Midgar. I just think there's too much to squeeze in there for Part 2 to end at Temple of the Ancients. I think Temple of Ancients is awesome, and I think it would be a great place to end Part 2, but I think just in terms of pacing, it's not going to work. Because let's think about it. Broad strokes, let's go through it real quick. It'll probably start with Calm and the Nibelheim flashback. Then you have Junon, the cargo ship, Costa del Sol, North Corel, Gold Saucer, Corel Prison, Gungaga, Cosmo Canyon, Nibelheim, Shinra Mansion, Rocket Town, Temple of the Ancients. Part 1 was only Midgar. So, I mean, obviously, anything's possible. So it's possible that part 2 could end at the Temple of the Ancients. I just don't think it's likely. I think they expanded so much of one section in part 1. I just think there's too much to squeeze in for part 2 to end at Temple of the Ancients, but anything is possible. I could go all day theorizing about where part 2 might end, but let's just round it out at 3 theories, shall we? The third theory comes from a comment. The comment comes from Ken Eckert. So here's his comment. Zero desire to play this trash. They're coming in hot with this comment. But if the game wants to pace itself well, it should end with the events after Corel and the Choco race. The whole game is going to feel quite odd if we spend 25 hours in a 2 to 3 hour area, then in another 25 cover the next 20 in the original. I thought that was a very interesting comment, and it kind of reinforces my point. I think the Temple of the Ancients is just too far into the game that part 2 would end. So according to this comment, if we take into consideration part 1 was only Midgar, part 2 will probably start with Calm and possibly the Nibelheim flashback, and then end after the Corel prison and the Chocobo race. I actually think it's possible the game might end. I mean, anything's possible. But at the same time, I think that's going kind of too far in the other direction. It's kind of exaggerated in the other direction. I think ending at Corel prison and the Chocobo race, if people were complaining about part 1 being Midgar only, I mean, people are gonna riot if part 2 ends at the Chocobo race. I think a lot of people will love it regardless, and I think people will hate it regardless. I mean, you can't please everyone all of the time, but remember, you can't please anyone any of the time. But I did think that was a pretty interesting comment. I just think Corel Prison would be a little too early for part 2 to end. But if you go back to my theory, it would just go a little bit further with Gongaga and then Cosmo Canyon. So these have just been 3 theories on where part 2 will end, but there's obviously an infinite amount, and I'm sure you're going to disagree with me in the comments, which is fine. I don't mind that at all. Just try to be respectful. But definitely let me know your thoughts. Where do you think it might end? Another thing that I think about is how much do they want to give us in part 2 and how much do they want us to anticipate? What I mean by that, at least in terms of character, like part 2, do they want to give us both Sid and Vincent right away so we have the rest of the game to play as those characters, or do they want to give us something to wait for and anticipate? I personally wouldn't mind if they kind of waited on especially Vincent, because Vincent's such a cool character. I think it's possible they might reveal him too early, and there's just, for me, there wouldn't be a lot to anticipate left. But again, that's just my opinion, and that's probably a different video. But definitely let me know your thoughts on these 3 theories. Do you think they're interesting? Probably not. Do you think they're possible? Do you think they're ridiculous? Let me know where you think part 2 will end. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you like this video and you want to see more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Stay odd and keep on playing. I apologize for sweating. It's really hot in here and I had to turn off all the fans to record. And once I turn this camera off, I will become extremely irritable and irate. But I do all that off cam, out of love for the viewers.